The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered white with exhaustion, as though the message it bore could not wait even for the courtesy of rest. It was pressed into the hands of a housekeeper at a modest cottage on the edge of Camden Lane, a woman who did not yet know that the wax seal she turned over in her fingers. A crest of a falcon clutching a broken chain would alter the entire course of a young woman's life before the week was through. Inside the cottage, seated near a window fogged with the breath of a cold October dawn, sat Miss Eleanor Hartwell, 23 years of age, dressed in mourning grey, though her father had been dead nearly a year. She did not yet understand why a duke she had met only once, at a funeral she barely remembered, had thought to remember her at all. She broke the seal with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from a strange and unfamiliar hope she had long forbidden herself to feel. The letter was brief. Too brief, some might have said, for a matter of such consequence. It informed her, in the clipped and formal hand of a solicitor writing on behalf of the late Duke Reginald Ashworth, that she had been named sole inheritor of an estate known as Thornhallow, a property she had never seen, in a village she had never visited, bearing debts she could not yet imagine. The solicitor's letter did not explain why. It did not explain the Duke's reasoning, nor the years of silence that had preceded this sudden and staggering bequest. It offered only an address, a date, and a warning, half buried in formal language, that the estate was in a condition requiring immediate attention. No one in the house spoke of the true reason for the inheritance. Not then, not for a long while yet. What Eleanor did not know, what she could not have known, sitting there with the letter trembling in her lap, was that Thornhallow had once been the pride of the county, its fields golden with wheat, its orchards heavy with fruit sold as far as London markets. She did not know that its decline had not been an accident of poor harvests or bad weather, but the quiet, deliberate result of choices made by men who believed a dying estate was worth more to them broken than whole. She did not know that somewhere within the manor's locked east wing, sealed away by order of the late Duke himself, sat a collection of letters that would one day unravel everything she believed about her own family, her own name, and the man who had left her this strange and burdensome gift. She knew only that she had nothing left to lose, and a village waiting for her that no one else wanted. Before she could take a single step toward Thornhallow, however, there was a debt to be settled with her own history, a fall from grace that had brought her to this cottage, to this life of quiet mourning. In the first place, to understand what Eleanor would become, one must first understand what she had already lost. If you have found your way into this story tonight, take a moment now, before the tale draws you further in, to press that subscribe button, so that you never miss the next chapter of estates restored, secrets uncovered, and women who refuse to be forgotten. And while the fire is still low and the candle newly lit, tell us in the comments below where in the world you are watching from this evening. Some of the finest company on this channel gathers from villages and cities scattered across every corner of the earth, and it warms this story to know who sits beside it. Now, let us return to Camden Lane and to the woman who did not yet know what waited for her in the West. Eleanor Hartwell had not always lived in a cottage with damp creeping along its plaster walls. 3 years earlier, she had been the only daughter of Charles Hartwell, a gentleman of modest but respectable fortune, whose name had once been spoken with warmth in the drawing rooms of the county. Her mother had died when she was young, leaving her father to raise her with a tenderness uncommon among men of his station. He had taught her to read Latin before she was 10, to manage household accounts before she was 15, and to hold her tongue in company while never losing the sharpness of her own private judgment. It was this very sharpness, some said, that had made her too proud for a woman of her circumstances. Others said it was simply cruelty, the cruelty of fortune, which cares nothing for character. Her father's investments, tied unwisely to a shipping venture that foundered somewhere off the coast of Portugal, collapsed within a single season. What remained of the Hartwell name after the creditors had taken their due was not enough to maintain the house, the servants, or the modest carriage that had once carried Eleanor to assemblies and dinners where young gentlemen had vied, however cautiously, for her attention. Her father did not survive the shame of it. He died the following winter of what the physician called a weakening of the heart, though Eleanor privately believed it was something closer to a weakening of the will to continue in a world that had so swiftly stripped him of his dignity. She buried him in a modest plot at the edge of the village churchyard, without the black-plumed horses or the long procession that had marked her mother's funeral years before. There were no callers in the weeks that followed. The families who had once invited her to dine now crossed the street to avoid the awkwardness of acknowledging her. She learned in that year of mourning precisely how quickly the world could forget a woman once her fortune was gone. She learned to mend her own gowns, to economize on candles, to accept the quiet charity of a distant aunt who provided the small cottage on Camden Lane out of duty rather than affection. She did not complain. She had inherited her father's pride, if nothing else. And she wore it now like armor against a world that had already decided what she was worth. What remained hidden from her, in those long months of quiet grief, was the reason her father's ruin had come so suddenly, so completely, so conveniently for certain men of business who had profited from his fall. She did not yet know that the shipping venture which failed had been engineered to fail, that letters existed proving certain gentlemen had withdrawn their capital mere days before the collapse, having received private word of what was to come. She did not know that one of those gentlemen bore a name she would soon come to know intimately, a name connected, however distantly, to the very duke who had just left her an estate in ruins. It was into this quiet, diminished life that the letter arrived on that Tuesday morning, disturbing a peace that was not truly peace at all, but a kind of frozen waiting, the waiting of a woman who no longer expected anything good to find her. She spent 3 days deliberating whether to accept the inheritance at all. Her aunt counselled against it, calling it a fool's errand, a burden dressed as a blessing. A dying estate is still a debt, the older woman said, folding linens with brisk, disapproving hands. You will inherit ruin and call it fortune, because you are too proud to admit you have nothing else. But Eleanor had already begun to feel something stir within her that she had not felt since her father's death. Not hope, precisely for hope had proven itself an unreliable companion, but a kind of quiet, stubborn resolve. If Thornhallow was ruined, then perhaps ruin was the one thing she now understood better than anyone. She wrote to the solicitor accepting the bequest before the week was out. The journey west took the better part of 2 days, first by coach along roads rutted with the season's early rains, then by a hired cart driven by a taciturn farmer who seemed reluctant to speak of the estate at all. When she asked him directly what manner of place awaited her, he only shook his head and murmured something about the old duke's temper and how no one in the village spoke ill of the dead. Not there, not about that family. It was not the answer she had hoped for, and it left her with a low, persistent unease that settled into her chest and did not lift, even as the carriage crested the final hill and Thornhallow came into view for the first time. The manor stood against a grey November sky like something half-remembered from a dream, its stone fades streaked black with age and neglect, its west tower missing a section of roof entirely, open to the weather, like a wound that had never been permitted to heal. Ivy had claimed the lower walls so thoroughly that in places it was difficult to tell where the building ended and the overgrowth began. Windows stood dark and empty, save for one, high in the east wing, where a single candle flickered faintly behind glass, though no one, as far as Eleanor could discover, had any business being in that part of the house at all. She did not yet understand what that candle meant. she would not understand for many weeks yet. A small staff remained, fewer than a dozen souls, where once, she would later learn, nearly 40 had been employed to maintain the grounds and the great house alike. Among them was Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, a woman whose face had settled into permanent lines of worry, and whose eyes followed Eleanor with an expression that was not quite suspicion, but not quite welcome either. There was also an old groundskeeper named Thomas, bent nearly double with age, who tended what remained of the gardens with a devotion that seemed almost desperate, as though he alone still believed the land could be saved. And there was a young maid, barely 16, named Sarah, whose hands shook whenever the subject of the East Wing arose, and who found sudden and urgent reasons to leave the room whenever Eleanor asked too many questions. The estate's condition, once Eleanor began her survey of it, proved worse than even the solicitor's cautious warning had suggested. Fields that should have lain fallow and prepared for spring planting stood choked with weeds. The tenant cottages, home to families who had worked this land for generations, showed roofs in disrepair and walls patched with whatever materials could be salvaged. The accounts, when Mrs. Pruitt finally produced them with visible reluctance, revealed debts owed to merchants in 3 counties, wages unpaid to remaining staff for the better part of a year, and a mortgage against the land itself that would come due within 18 months. A debt so substantial that Eleanor felt, for one long moment standing in the cold study with ledgers spread before her, that she had not inherited a fortune at all, but a slow and certain catastrophe with her name now attached to it. And yet, beneath the neglect, she began to notice things the solicitor's letter had not mentioned. The soil, when she knelt in the fallow east field and pressed her fingers into it, was rich and dark, unusually so for land so poorly maintained, as though it had been deliberately left fallow rather than genuinely exhausted. The old stone mill at the river's edge, though its wheel had rotted through, sat upon a channel of water swift and strong enough to power machinery far more valuable than the estate's current use suggested. And the vineyard, for there was a vineyard, half forgotten on the southern slope, its vines gone wild and untended for years, carried, even in its neglect, the unmistakable structure of something, once carefully and expertly planted. Someone, she began to suspect, had let this land fail on purpose. That suspicion deepened on her 3rd night at Thornhallow, when sleeplessness drove her from her chamber and down the unlit corridor toward the library, in search of nothing more than a book to occupy her restless mind. It was there, in the flickering light of a single candle she carried herself, that she first noticed the door to the east wing stood very slightly ajar. A door she had been told, twice now, by 2 different servants, was permanently locked by order of the late Duke, its key lost or destroyed years before. She did not enter that night. She told herself it was prudence, though later she would admit it was something closer to fear, an instinct, deep and wordless, that whatever lay beyond that door was not meant to be found easily, and that finding it would change something in her that could not be unchanged again. She returned to her chamber, and she did not sleep. What remained hidden was far more dangerous than a locked door and an old candle. It would be weeks before Eleanor understood that the light she had seen on her first arrival and the door left ajar that sleepless night were connected to a presence in the house that no one, not Mrs. Pruitt, not Thomas, not even young Sarah, dared speak of directly. Years later, when the full truth of Thornhallow finally came to light, Eleanor would say that the estate had not simply been neglected, it had been guarded. And the reason for that guarding was a secret so carefully buried that it had cost men their reputations and one woman very nearly her life to keep it from the world. The following morning, Eleanor resolved to begin where any sensible steward of ruined land might begin, not with mysteries and locked doors, but with the practical business of survival. She called the remaining staff together in the draughty great hall its long table scarred and its tapestries faded to little more than ghosts of their original colour, and she informed them, in a voice she willed to remain steady, that Thornhallow was not finished yet. Mrs. Pruitt's expression suggested she did not believe this in the slightest. Thomas, however, straightened at the words, and something in his weathered face softened, as though he had been waiting a very long time for someone to say precisely that. Eleanor began with the vineyard, for reasons she could not entirely explain even to herself, perhaps because it was the one part of the estate that still showed, beneath its neglect, evidence of care once given freely and expertly. She spent her mornings walking the southern slope with Thomas, learning what she could of the vines that remained, discovering that, beneath the wildness, the rootstock was old and hardy, planted by a vintner brought over, Thomas said, from the Rene Valley itself, decades before, at the personal expense of a duke who had once dreamed of English wine to rival the finest cellars of the continent. Why was it abandoned? Eleanor asked him one grey morning, her boots soaked through with dew, her breath visible in the cold air. Thomas did not answer at once. He knelt instead beside a gnarled vine, his old fingers testing the wood for signs of rot. The old duke had a falling out, he said finally, with the man who kept the vineyard living. A terrible falling out. After that, no one was permitted to touch it. Not properly. I've kept it from dying entire, out of stubbornness more than instruction, but I was told plainly. No investment, no restoration, no attention paid to it at all. Told by whom? Thomas's eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the manor's east wing, visible even from the vineyard's slope, its broken tower stark against the sky. He said nothing further, and Eleanor did not press him, though she noted the direction of his gaze and filed it away among the growing collection of small, unexplained silences that seemed to surround every corner of Thornhallow. She did not yet understand that the falling out Thomas spoke of was connected directly to the ruin of her own father's fortune, that the vintner in question had been a business associate of Charles Hartwell's, and that his departure from Thornhallow had coincided, almost to the month, with the failure of the very shipping venture that had destroyed her family. She would not learn this until much later, when a name in an old ledger caught her eye and refused to release its hold on her thoughts. Within a fortnight, Eleanor had assessed enough of the estate's condition to understand that restoration, if it were possible at all, would require capital she did not possess and connections she had long since lost. It was this realization that brought her, reluctantly, into contact with the man whose name had haunted every conversation at Thornhallow since her arrival, spoken always in tones of caution, and sometimes in tones that bordered on fear. Duke Julian Ashworth, cousin and heir presumptive to the late Duke's title, arrived at Thornhallow on a bitter afternoon in late November, his carriage announced by the sound of hooves on gravel long before Eleanor caught sight of him from the study window. She had been warned of his coming by a brief note delivered that morning, a note that offered no explanation beyond his intention to discuss matters pertaining to the estate. In a tone so formal, it read, almost as a threat. He was younger than she had expected, though older than herself by perhaps a decade, tall and composed in a manner that suggested a man accustomed to rooms falling silent when he entered them. His eyes, dark and unreadable, moved over the great hall's faded grandeur with an expression Eleanor could not immediately place, not quite disdain, not quite grief, but some complicated admixture of both, as though the house's decline was a wound he carried personally, though he was careful never to say so directly. Miss Hartwell, he said, with a bow precise enough to be correct and cold enough to convey that courtesy was, for him, a matter of duty rather than warmth. I confess, I did not expect my late cousin's final act to be quite so unconventional. Nor did I expect to inherit ruin, Your Grace, Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze without flinching, though her heart beat unsteadily beneath her composed exterior. And yet here we both are. Something flickered across his face at that, surprise, perhaps, or a reluctant flash of respect, though it was gone before she could name it with any certainty. He informed her, in the clipped and businesslike manner of a man delivering news he had rehearsed, that the estate's mortgage, held by his own family's bank, would come due within the year, and that should she fail to meet the obligation, Thornhallow would revert to the Ashworth family entire, its lands absorbed into his own considerably more prosperous holdings. It was, Eleanor understood at once, an offer disguised as information, an invitation, however coldly delivered, for her to simply surrender now and spare them both the tedious business of watching her fail. She declined to take the bait, though she said nothing of her intentions beyond a cool assurance that she understood the terms perfectly well. He did not yet understand, nor did she, fully at that moment, that his own presence at Thornhallow was entangled with secrets far older and more dangerous than a mortgage and a failing vineyard. What remained hidden between them was a connection neither had yet discovered. That the late Duke's decision to leave the estate to a stranger rather than his own cousin had not been madness, nor sentiment, nor the confused judgment of a dying man, but a deliberate act of protection of a truth that Julian Ashworth's own father had spent a fortune trying to bury. The weeks that followed brought Eleanor deeper into the daily labour of Thornhallow's slow revival, and deeper, too, into its accumulating mysteries. She discovered, quite by accident, a set of ledgers hidden behind a false panel in the study. Ledgers that recorded transactions dating back nearly 15 years, written in a hand she did not recognise, documenting payments made quietly, methodically, to suppress information regarding the estate's true agricultural value. Someone had known, long before Eleanor's arrival, that Thornhallow's soil and water and vines were worth a fortune, and someone had spent considerable sums ensuring that fact remained buried alongside the estate's reputation for ruin. She began, cautiously, to draw young Sarah into her confidence, for the girl's nervous silences suggested she knew more than she dared to say. It took patience, and no small measure of kindness, the offer of a warmer shawl on a cold evening, a quiet word of reassurance that no harm would come to her for speaking honestly, before Sarah finally confessed, in a whisper barely audible over the crackle of the study fire, that the candle Eleanor had seen on her first night was no trick of memory. Someone did occupy a chamber in the sealed east wing. Someone had occupied it for years, in fact, ever since the falling out Thomas had spoken of, hidden away by the old Duke's own order, fed and tended in secret by a rotation of servants sworn to silence under threat of dismissal without reference. A fate, in service, very nearly as ruinous as debtor's prison itself. "Who is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely steady. Sarah shook her head, tears standing in her eyes. "I've never seen a face, miss, only heard the weeping, some nights. And once, only once, I heard singing, an old song, in a woman's voice, though cracked with age and grief." The revelation settled over Eleanor like a physical weight. A woman, hidden in her own house, weeping in the dark for reasons no one would speak aloud. She thought of the door left ajar on her first sleepless night, and she understood, with a certainty she could not entirely justify, that she would not rest until she had climbed that staircase and confronted whatever waited behind it. She did not act at once. Caution and a growing awareness that the mysteries of Thornhallow were tangled together with dangers she did not yet fully comprehend held her back through the whole of December, even as the practical work of restoration began, slowly to show its first small successes. Thomas, given at last the freedom and the modest funds Eleanor could scrape together, began the careful pruning and replanting of the southern vineyard. A miller from the neighbouring village, intrigued by Eleanor's inquiries about the old stone mill, agreed to inspect its wheel and pronounced it salvageable with proper investment Elianan did not yet have, but had begun, with growing determination, to seek. It was in pursuit of that investment that Eleanor first encountered the merchant families of the nearest market town, and it was there, in a conversation with an elderly wool trader who had known her father slightly in better days, that she heard a name that stopped her breath entirely. The name of the vintner who had once tended Thornhallow's vines, the very man Thomas had spoken of with such careful silence, the man whose falling out with the old Duke had begun the estate's long decline. His name, the wool trader said, without any notion of the weight his words carried, was Mr. Edmund Vane, her own mother's brother, and Uncle Eleanor had believed dead for over a decade. Banished from the family's memory so thoroughly that his name had never once been spoken in her father's house. She did not yet understand how her uncle's history connected to her father's ruin, to the old Duke's decision to leave her this estate, or to the weeping woman hidden in the East Wing. But she understood, with the cold clarity of a puzzle beginning at last to assemble itself, that she had not been chosen for this inheritance by chance, sentiment, or the confused whim of a dying stranger. She had been chosen because she was, in some manner not yet revealed to her, already woven into the very fabric of Thornhallow's secrets, and that the old Duke, whatever else his failings, had wanted her, specifically, to be the one to uncover them. It was this discovery that finally drove her, on a night in early January, when frost had silvered every window of the great house, to take up her candle once more and climb the staircase toward the East Wing, resolved at last to learn the truth for herself. Whatever the cost of learning it might prove to be, the staircase groaned beneath her feet in a manner that suggested it had not borne regular weight in a very long time. Dust lay thick upon the balustrade, disturbed only by a single, narrower trail near the wall, the passage, she understood now, of whichever servant carried meals and comfort to the room's hidden occupant. The portraits lining the corridor watched her with the flat, painted eyes of Ashworth ancestors long dead, their gilt frames tarnished, their expressions unreadable in the wavering candlelight. The door stood ajar again, as it had on her first night, and through the gap came a faint, unsteady light, and the low, broken sound of a woman singing to herself, an old lullaby, half forgotten, sung in a voice cracked by age and years of disuse. Eleanor pushed the door open. What she found within that chamber would take her the better part of the following weeks to fully understand, though the shape of it revealed itself immediately in the candlelit face that turned toward her, startled and afraid, from a chair beside a cold hearth. The woman was elderly, her hair silver and unbound, her gown decades out of fashion, her eyes, when they met Eleanor's own, holding an expression of such raw and desperate hope that Eleanor felt the breath catch entirely in her chest. "You have her eyes," the woman whispered, rising unsteadily from her chair. "God forgive me, child, you have your mother's eyes exactly." It was in that moment, standing in a forgotten room at the top of a forgotten staircase, that Eleanor Hartwell first learnt the name of the woman who had been hidden away at Thornhallow for over a decade, a woman the old Duke had sworn, upon his own honour, to protect until the day someone came who could finally, safely, bring the truth into the light. The woman was Eleanor's own grandmother, believed dead by the entire Hartwell family, kept in careful and desperate hiding because the truth of what she knew about a fraud, a betrayal, and a fortune stolen from beneath her son-in-law's feet had once been dangerous enough to get a man killed, and might yet prove dangerous again, should the wrong ears learn she still lived. The full truth, when it finally emerged over the long and painful conversations that followed, connected every thread Eleanor had gathered since her arrival at Thornhallow. Years before, her grandmother, Margaret Vane, had discovered that her own brother Edmund's departure from the estate had not been the product of any falling out with the old Duke at all, but a carefully staged deception, orchestrated by the very shipping investors who would later engineer the collapse of Charles Hartwell's fortune. Edmund Vane had uncovered evidence, in his years managing Thornhallow's vineyard and its books, that certain gentlemen of business, among them, to Eleanor's growing horror, the late Duke's own brother, father to Julian Ashworth himself, had been systematically diverting estate profits into private ventures, falsifying the ledgers to disguise Thornhallow's true wealth as poverty, all while quietly bleeding the land dry for their own private enrichment. When Edmund threatened to expose the fraud, he was discredited, his reputation ruined by whispered accusations of theft and drunkenness that Margaret always believed to be entirely false. He fled the country rather than face trial on charges he could not disprove, and died, some years later, in circumstances Margaret herself had never fully learned. Margaret, left behind and grieving, made the fatal error of confronting the old Duke directly with what she knew, only to discover that the Duke himself, horrified upon learning the extent of his own brother's corruption, chose not exposure but containment. He could not undo the fraud already committed, nor clear Edmund's ruined name without unravelling his own family's reputation entirely. And so he made the only choice his conscience and his fear would permit. He hid Margaret away at Thornhallow, under his own protection, safe from the men who had already destroyed her brother, and who would not hesitate to silence her as well, and he waited, for years, as it turned out, for a way to make things right, without destroying everyone he loved in the process. That way, Eleanor now understood with a clarity that left her trembling, was her. The old Duke, dying and finally free of the fear that had bound his silence for over a decade, had chosen to leave Thornhallow to Charles Hartwell's daughter, the granddaughter of the very woman he had sheltered, the niece of the man his own family had ruined, trusting that she alone would have both the personal stake and the quiet determination to uncover the truth and finally set it right, without the political entanglements that had paralysed him for so long. It also explained, with a bitterness that settled cold in Eleanor's chest, precisely why her father's fortune had collapsed so suddenly and so completely. The same men who had falsified Thornhallow's ledgers had recognised, in Charles Hartwell's growing business relationship with the vindicated Edmund Vane's associates, a threat to their continued concealment. They had engineered his ruin not from casual greed, but from calculated necessity, silencing, quite deliberately, a man who might otherwise have stumbled upon the very fraud his own daughter would one day be asked to expose. Julian Ashworth, when Eleanor finally confronted him with the full weight of what she had discovered, the ledgers, Margaret's testimony, the connections tracing back through years of careful concealment, did not respond with the cold denial she had half expected. Instead, something in his composed exterior seemed, for the first time since their acquaintance began, to genuinely crack. He confessed, with visible and reluctant shame, that he had long suspected his own father's business dealings were not entirely honest, though he had never possessed proof, and had chosen, out of a complicated loyalty to his family's name, not to look too closely at suspicions he could not bear to confirm. "I did not know of the woman in the East Wing," he said quietly, standing in the same faded great hall where they had first exchanged their cold and guarded introductions. "I swear to you, Miss Hartwell, I did not know that. Whatever else my father did, I did not know he had ruined a family to protect his own fraud, nor that my cousin had spent his final years imprisoned by his own guilt into silence." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing the truth of his words against everything she had learned to distrust in men of his class and station. What she found, finally, was not the villain she had half expected, but a man caught, as she herself had once been, in the wreckage of choices made by those who came before him. A man given the chance, now, to decide whether he would continue his father's silence or help her finally break it. He chose, in the end, to help her. The unravelling of the fraud, once Julian's own family resources and legal connections were turned toward exposing it rather than concealing it, proceeded with a swiftness that surprised even Eleanor. The falsified ledgers, cross-referenced against Margaret's decade-old testimony and corroborated by surviving correspondence from Edmund Vane's final years abroad, painted a picture too complete and too damning for the remaining conspirators to escape. Two gentlemen of business, still active in London's financial circles, found their reputations and their fortunes collapsing within the season, in a reversal that Eleanor could not help but recognise with grim satisfaction as a mirror of what had once been done to her own father. Edmund Vane's name was formally cleared before the county's assembled gentry in a hearing that Margaret, frail but resolute, insisted on attending herself, the first time in over a decade that she had stepped beyond Thornhallow's walls. Her presence alone serving as evidence more powerful than any ledger that the story told about her brother's disgrace had been a lie from its very foundation. Eleanor stood beside her grandmother throughout the proceedings, and if there had been any lingering doubt among the assembled families about her right to Thornhallow, or about her capability to hold it, that doubt did not survive the sight of Margaret Vane's quiet, unshakable dignity as the truth was finally spoken aloud. With the fraud exposed and the false debts against Charles Hartwell's memory finally cleared, Eleanor discovered, in the careful accounting that followed, that Thornhallow's true financial position was far healthier than anyone had believed. Years of diverted profits, once traced and partially recovered through legal settlement, restored enough capital to the estate to clear the looming mortgage entirely, freeing Thornhallow from the Ashworth family's claim without Eleanor needing to surrender an acre of the land she had come to love with a fierceness she had not expected to feel for a place she had known only a few short months. Spring came to Thornhallow that year with a transformation that even Thomas, in all his decades tending its soil, called nothing short of a miracle. The vineyard, properly pruned and finally granted the investment it had been so long denied, produced its first healthy harvest in over 10 years. The old mill's wheel, repaired at last with capital no longer needed to service a fraudulent debt, began grinding grain again for the first time in a generation, drawing custom from villages that had long since taken their business elsewhere. The tenant cottages, roofs mended and walls repaired, filled once more with families who had begun, cautiously and then with growing confidence, to believe that Thornhallow's long decline had truly, finally, come to its end. Eleanor herself changed more slowly, in ways less visible than the land around her, but no less profound. The proud, careful reserve she had worn since her father's death, a reserve built as protection against a world that had shown her how quickly it could turn, began, gradually, to soften into something closer to genuine warmth. She found, in the daily labour of restoration, a purpose that had been entirely absent from the quiet grief of her life on Camden Lane. She found in her grandmother's rescued presence a connection to family she had believed lost forever, and she found, though she was slower to admit this even to herself, a growing and unexpected respect in her dealings with Julian Ashworth, whose own transformation, from cold air protecting a tarnished name to genuine partner in righting his family's wrongs, proved, in the end, no less remarkable than the revival of Thornhallow's own neglected soil. By the following autumn, a full year after the letter had first arrived on that Tuesday morning to disturb the quiet grief of Camden Lane, Thornhallow's harvest was celebrated as the finest in the region, its wine already commanding prices that rivaled imports from the continent, its grain feeding villages for miles around, its tenant families more secure and more prosperous than they had been in living memory. The estate that the old Duke had left to a stranger as what many believed to be a burden dressed as inheritance had become, through patience, intelligence, and a refusal to accept the ruin others had assumed was inevitable, the wealthiest land in the entire region. Eleanor Hartwell stood, on the evening of that first great harvest celebration, upon the same terrace where she had first surveyed the estate's ruin nearly a year before, watching lantern light flicker across fields that had once lain choked with weeds and now stood golden with abundance. Her grandmother sat nearby, wrapped warmly against the evening chill, her face turned toward the sound of laughter and music drifting up from the tenants gathered below sounds of genuine celebration that Thornhallow had not heard in over a decade. She thought, in that quiet moment, of her father, and of the ruin that had once seemed so final, so complete, so impossible to overcome. She thought of the old Duke, whose final act of quiet courage had set in motion everything that followed, and whose grave, she had resolved, would finally receive the proper remembrance his complicated, imperfect conscience had earned. And she thought of herself, 3 years removed from a cottage on Camden Lane, where she had once believed the world had forgotten her entirely, standing now upon land that bore her family's name with pride rather than shame. A story preserved in the quiet memory of an old English estate does not end, perhaps, so much as it settles into the soil, into the stone, into the long and patient work of those who choose to tend what others have abandoned. Thornhallow's fields would yield their harvests for generations after that first triumphant autumn, and the tale of the young woman who arrived expecting ruin and built, instead, the finest inheritance in the county, would be told in villages nearby for years to come, passed down as the sort of story that reminds each new listener that fortune, once lost, is not always lost forever. And that sometimes the truest inheritance a person can receive is not land, nor title, nor wealth, but simply the chance to prove, at last, exactly what they were always capable of becoming.